welcome to another episode of Thinking Historically About. And today we are thinking historically about the labor movement that sits at the tail end of the 19th century into the 20th century. And looking at the causes of this labor movement. Why would a labor movement happen? As our guest today, we have Dr. Dylan Shearer, a historian of labor and memory in American history around this era, the 19th and 20th century. So I'm really excited for Dr. Shearer's just wisdom in this era, which I am personally unfamiliar with, and hopefully give you, the students, tools to engage with this unit on your own. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to talk about it. I don't know how much wisdom I can bring, but hopefully, some thinking about it at least.
Yeah, well, that's like a true historian answer, right? So let's start and just get to know you, the scholar. What drew you to this era and area of history, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did my master's 2 years before I started going to get my PhD. And I knew that I was interested in history. I didn't really have that much, labor really wasn't on the top of my mind. But I took this class actually on sort of European French, pre-World War I, turn of the century history. And that really brought to my attention this area specifically, just thinking about sort of the ways that literally just the calendar changing from, 1899 to 1900 was sort of changing the cultural landscape and the intellectual landscape of Europe and the United States as well. So that got me really interested in this part of history. And then sort of the labor aspect came in a little bit later, just with some of the stuff that was happening. I started writing my dissertation and going into grad school during the time of, the big movement to get a union in Amazon, lots of these sort of strikes, and just thinking about the ways that labor was still really important today. And then also sort of very local history. I moved to a street in Chicago that was named the Honorary Lucy Parsons Street. And I didn't know who that was. And I looked her up. And she was this very intriguing, interesting person, historical character. And that got me thinking a lot about the ways that we remember these famous laborers or don't remember these laborers, or how we just remember them. So basically a class and a street sign is really what got me interested in this part of history.
And what I appreciate about your own focus is that piece on memory. It was a book on our memory of the Civil War that historian David Blight wrote that grabbed my attention. But so often as historians, you kind of focus on an era of the past, and then I think I see more and more historians who are asking, well, how do we see that era 20 years later, 50 years later, and even now? And that becomes a whole new lens to see the past. Yeah, I mean, when you told me your dissertation topic, I immediately perked up, because I think that's a really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting because I think a lot of times as historians, we sort of try to distance ourselves, in a way, this is the past and the past is the
Sure.
past. But also our own memories of what we think of that past are so influential to our writing, whether, we like to admit it or not, that I think looking at that memory aspect of it is really important. Because you grow up learning in high school or middle school, a certain thing, and that can stick with you, subconsciously or not. So learning where those come from, I think, is super interesting and important.
And I think it's a reminder of the people we study. I don't know, just thinking about this unit, there's, and we'll get to the question in a second, students, yeah. But there's these broader causes, these almost idea-centered causes for the labor movement. But there's also these visceral experiences that the people in the United States at this time felt and reacted to. And I think the understanding of memory history, I should say his history of memories, is similar, that, we have these kind of withdrawn intellectual understandings of the past, but also we have the 4th of July as a holiday. That means we're going to remember it in a particular way. And those are always good reminders. So I would love to hear kind of how you would approach the question, the same question that the students are engaging with. And so here's how the prompt reads. It says, to evaluate the relative importance of different causes for the growth of the labor movement in the United States from 1865 to 1920. So I just love to hear you parse that out. What jumps out to you? What are you focusing on?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of things that sort of leap out to me at this question. I mean, the first is relative importance, right? Because with all any historical question, it's all about relativity. Because even just thinking about this, you can isolate 4 different, like 4 or 5 different like big reasons, but they're all reasons, right? So they're all so important. So I think keeping that in mind in this
Mhm.
question, like just because you might end up saying one had more effect than another doesn't mean that the other one didn't have a really important effect. And so making sure you're not discrediting something. And the other one is sort of for me, and this is probably too big for like an essay or something, but for to think about, and I think it's really important, is the United States is so big during this time too that the labor movement looks different in different places. So you see in the South versus the North, the West, even just these big 3 categories. To me, I'm maybe thinking specifically about a place if I'm answering this question, which I think most teachers would let you do, right? They wouldn't ding you for not talking about all the United States. But then going sort of, another big thing for me is that we have this time frame, 1865 to 1920. And when I think about this question, we like to like isolate it here, but then it's always important to look to what happened before too. So looking about, thinking if you have like resources or you just remember something from a Civil War unit, right? What happened during the Civil War is probably pretty important, especially thinking about labor, right? Who's working, who's not working is probably important to this classes too. So bringing some of that past stuff. But for an actual answer, which I know historians hate to give actual answers to these things, for me, it's just that idea of like inequality is so important to this question. Just that first, just like the income inequality, the ideas of the Gilded Age, right? You have these people living in New York, in Manhattan, in these giant mansions. And then you have like the jungle type stuff, right? Where people are living in absolute desperate poverty, 2 blocks away from these mansions. But then equality, it sort of expresses itself in other ways too. One, just like the way that a lot of these workers were treated during this time, like these cultural inequalities were also massive. You don't like every book that come out this time, Ragged Dick, all these books, the heroes are always sort of, that the upper echelon of people. So there's that cultural inequality, right? You're looked down upon. It's seen as like a moral bad for a lot of people to be poor, right? So that sort of inequality. And then also just the political inequality. You read, so many stories of this time of just people literally like paying bribes on the floor of the Senate to get, their tax break on building a railroad, or, literally just like there's a big strike on the B&O Railroad. And one of the reasons why the National Guard is called in is because the president, of the United States was literally on that railroad with the owner of the railroad who convinced him to call in the National Guard, right? So you have this like all different sorts of inequality at that time. And I think that is probably like of the answers it could be, right? Talking about like the influences of European philosophical thought, this rapid urbanization going on at this time, the sort of living and working conditions. I think the sort of that idea of inequality is really, really huge. And I think that's true. People at the time also saw that, right? They're not blind. They see these giant mansions and, they see where they live. You read these political cartoons or writings, everyone's always talking about like the altar of Mammon, like this, the god of greed, basically. So it's very much, I think, this inequality on like people's minds. So that's sort of, I think, if come to like an ultimate answer to this question, that's like what I think of the relative importance. It's that sort of inequality that's just like very pervasive.
Yeah. So 2 things I kind of gathered as you were talking. The first is that the labor movement was very much local to the people who experienced it, right? So someone in the South experienced a different labor movement than someone in the North or the West. But also there's these ideas that can be linked throughout the individual experiences, and you brought up inequality. And so my next question, I'm going to broaden a little bit. And so often what I'll do is I'll ask a historian, what's a go-to primary source for this to understand this era a little bit more deeply. But I'm going to couple that question with also maybe what is a good case study? So even bigger than an individual source, but like a moment or an event that maybe doesn't capture the Northwest and South, but captures one of them really well. I don't know, to kind of illuminate these, this thinking of inequality and tying in these, European ideals of, like socialism or communism. How can we see that through the lens of people?
Yeah, I'll start with the primary source. So one thing that I always like to do when I sort of teach this era is bring in, that's like technically I'm cheating. It's 3 different primary sources, but it's 3 different songs. One is John Brown's Body The other is the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and then the third one is Solidarity Forever. So these are they're all the same tune song, but they all have different words to them. John Brown's Body was written about John Brown, one of the sort of martyrs of the Civil War era, this white guy who fought to free slaves, enslaved people. And then the Battle Hymn of the Republic took that tune of that song. They wrote new words to it for the Union, right? So fighting once again to help free enslaved people, and the Confederacy. And then you have a couple of years later, this is technically a little bit, I think, out of the range of the time, but very much of the moment, is Solidarity Forever, which once again takes that same tune and rewrites the words to be about sort of workers' rights and workers' power. And so I think that those three primary sources really illustrate the connections between all this stuff. That it's not just sort of, the 1865 to 1920, but that there's this whole thing, and that the workers of the time know that and like understand that. Finally, sort of the case study, one thing I really think that doesn't get talked about that much, or I think it should be talked about more, is there's something called the Colorado Labor Wars, which happened in like 1903, 1904, 1905. And there are this series of strikes by the WFM, which is this pre-IWW group. They're like really radical. Big Bill Haywood was the leader, one of the leaders of it. They were one of like the founding members of the IWW, the Western Federation of Miners, and they go on strike basically to get an 8-hour workday. Sort of the build up to this is that twice before this, workers had once passed a law, sort of like one of these amendments, coming out of the progressive movement that made it legal in the Colorado to be an 8-hour workday, and that was overturned. The Supreme Court said it was illegal or whatever. So they tried again. They got another thing passed, and this time the Senate just basically legally was like, we're not allowing this to happen. So the workers started going on strike. And at this time, Colorado was basically just run by mine owners. Mining was like the big industry. So the governor owned a mine. The head of the state guard he didn't own it, but he was like the overseer of the mine. Every third senator, every other senator was a mine owner. So these guys basically went to the governor and were like, you have to stop this strike. So the governor came in with the military, ended this big strike, and there's lots of like different like literal physical battles going on. Like people are shooting guns in lines at each other in the state. The state ends up building special trains, like literally fortified train cars, to ship out miners to different states to basically deport them from the state so they don't come back. And I think that's really just an example of like the lengths that the people who were probably against unions, people who were against these organized workers would go to stop these strikes from happening. And it was like readings of the Constitution, right, are all a suspect, but like this was probably all pretty illegal. But because they sort of, ran the state government, nothing ever really happened to them. The U.S. government eventually did a study of this and was like, this is like in a state actual like federal document. They're like the mine owners spent like $1 million to end this strike. Would have like lost them $500,000, but they were so desperate to like end the strike that they spent all this money. I think that's really like a great sort of case study of what was going on at this time in these sort of labor battles and why people wanted to be in them in the first place.
Yeah, and what's so striking is I feel like we have these, and sometimes maybe they are naive, but hopefully they're more idealistic. But like those in the government are stewards of democracy. And then there's, I think, a modern conception that those that maybe have more socialist leanings aren't. And what's interesting about this Colorado story is that it's kind of the inverse, right? Like here you have these people fighting for labor rights, using the democratic system, right? Following even through the separation of powers and how we democratically elect and how the Supreme Court's involved, and the stewards of this power basically squash democracy in the name of capital.
Yeah, and it's wild because it wasn't even like we went to demand part ownership of the mines. It was literally like 8-hour workday, and they're like, no, absolutely not. Like we won't let this happen. It's an incredible story.
I appreciate you bringing it up. One thing I've been thinking about with the labor movement is, and like through, the question that students are engaging us, evaluate the relative importance. So we see a lot of these experiences that are causing people to unite in the name of, equitable labor, fair labor. But they're also kind of rooted in what's going on in Europe and some of the ideas. The modern education system may give Karl Marx a bad rap, but his ideas for pushing for equality and supporting hard work, I always find really encouraging and hopeful. But anyway, what I'm trying to ask, like, you have these ideas from Europe. Can the labor movement in the US happen without them? And I know that's a hypothetical question. It's not necessarily a historical question, but I'm just curious because I know that they're both involved, but I'm almost wondering if Europe doesn't happen, if the ideas that come out of that don't happen, is there enough force in like the experiences of what's happening on the ground in the US to keep this movement going?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Part of me wants to say yes. I mean, like America is always like the weird country historically because we never really had like a big labor party that was like specifically for labor. Or if you look at all these European countries, they did. But even pre-Europe, there's lots of like stuff going on. I mean, and because like the U.S. is so historically interconnected with Europe and Great Britain, it's really hard to separate that. But even looking like pre-Civil War, pre-Marx, there's the Lowell Mill Girls who are, fighting and organizing. People maybe don't call it a union technically or whatever, but they're definitely an organized group of laborers fighting for labor rights. And then even if you go back to the Revolutionary period, there's this great book called Revolutionary Founders, I believe. It's a bunch of essays, so they're all really short to read. But it's about there's all these really radical politicians in American history, especially around the Revolution, that we sort of just forget about because they don't get taught. So guys like, his name's either Herman Husband or Herbert Husband, I'm forgetting, who literally was like, all for like building these basically big compounds where the workers would own everything and like work in Congress with each other to build all this stuff. Thomas Paine had some really like radical ideas about labor too. And even, like the French Revolution, which I guess is sort of talking about these European ideas, right? But sort of separate from Marx, like I think there's the seeds there. It definitely helped to get all these thinkers, like not just Marx, but like people like Bakunin and some of the anarchists were really influential. But the U.S. built a lot of its own laborers without like who are probably at some point influenced by European thought, but didn't necessarily need it to have these ideas.
Is there scholarship on seeing the enslaved workforce as a labor movement, right? Because we like, one of our other units is on slave resistance and like looking at the way that enslaved people worked together despite their circumstances to kind of make the best, the most of their life. And that may mean running away. It may mean a revolt. But in a sense, these are, products of some sort of labor unification, even if it wasn't, the modern terms. But I'm just curious if there's work out there in that regard.
There's lots of scholarship about like work under slavery that you don't really get much about sort of like calling it unionized, right? It's a lot of it's like resistance, and there's like later, so like much more modern work about like work under slavery or work under, enslavement. I'm trying to, there wouldn't, at least that I can recall, nothing like calling it about unions just because like, or like even labor formations, because that's such like a specific term about like, what is, but the very much sort of about like work under slavery and how people were working through all that is like a really big part of the field too. Sort of ties that bind is one of these big ones. There's lots of stuff earlier about sort of like Black culture and like slave culture. It has to deal a lot of that. David Byron Davis wrote Inhuman Bondage, which deals with some of that as well.
That's right. I guess like I'm probably trying to be a little anachronistic about applying certain terms.
I think the ideas are there, but yeah, it's like the terminology doesn't quite fit. But the idea of like definitely, because there were ways, right, to make the work easier that involved working with others. It wouldn't necessarily be that sort of thing. And then the big book, and this is for all the real history heads out there, is the Amy Drew Stanley Contracts book, which that's really, really dense and do not recommend for anybody unless they're trying to go to sleep. No offense to Dr. Stanley, but
filled with a wealth of knowledge, I'm sure. Good insights, maybe just hard to access. So for students engaging with this, I think there's elements of kind of a Southern perspective. There's the document on the Mississippi washerwoman. There's different perspectives that, play more political. You have perspectives that cover Black experiences, Chinese experiences, white American experiences in this labor movement. But obviously, by having kind of that breadth, you maybe can't dive as deeply into a particular experience. But I'm curious, what might be another, perspective that students might want to either take a little bit further than what the documents provide, or just isn't present there?
yeah, so I guess the thing that came to mind with this question is I'll go back to like sort of what got me interested in this period in the first place, but that sort of like turn of the century thing. One person who I think is really very interesting during this time is a populist, Mary Elizabeth Lease. She was known as like Mary Yellen, Yellen Ellen, right? She's this big speaker for the populists, talking a lot about the rights for women as well. And then once the populists sort of fell out, she became what was known as a spiritualist. So basically someone who was like, finding ghosts for people and talking to ghosts for people. And that was like that wasn't uncommon, right? During like the same time you get the buildup of the labor movement, you really get this buildup of like spiritualism in the United States. And I think I haven't done that much like research in this area, but I think it's a big area for like further exploration. There's lots of really interesting stuff around this time. And that comes with that like turn of the century. People think that like the world is going to go through this big change. Maybe it'll end. Maybe it'll just be like this crazy thing that happens. And like the labor movement becomes a part of that. You see a lot of that with Native American groups too, like the ghost stance and this idea that there'll be a new earth born into the United States, sort of all during this time, which is I think is really fascinating like combination, because the ghost dance too is also about labor just as much as it was about like freedom and rights for people.
Sure. Yeah. And I think there's actually a lot of, I'm just thinking my own, studying that explores more of that spirituality aspect of the turn of the century there. And you have like the social gospel is like a huge movement that comes out of like it almost is going like in tandem with the labor movement. And yeah, that spiritual component of the labor movement would definitely be
Yeah, because it leads people to basically say that like if you're poor, it means one, you're not working hard enough, and like two, you're a bad person, right? So it's like this very interesting like switch going on there.
All right, so students are engaging in this unit. They wrote their essays. What do we hope that they like take from this? If you're having students engage with this material, what's a goal you have for them? What do you want them to take out of the unit?
Yeah, I think just the big thing to know is that this didn't just happen in this period of time. That like the labor movement didn't just suddenly appear in 1865, that it was like it's a product of what happened before and it still continues after 1920. It changes in a lot of ways, but like it's not just during this time that it happens. A lot of times when we cover this unit, we sort of stop talking about labor after 1920. And there are, some reasons for that. Maybe it gets brought back up like post World War II with Detroit and stuff. But this was like a thing that's going on over this whole time. And that these people did it for very important reasons. One, namely that they're just a lot of their friends and family were like literally dying in the streets because they couldn't like get good food to eat, even though they were working like 10, 12 hours a day. Those are like the two big things that always stick with me whenever I sort of read about this or think about this.
Yeah, and I hope students that you continue, and that's like a good recommendation just for everything that you're engaging with in your classes. That we often look at moments in history to tell a particular story, but the experiences of people, like we can see a lot of continuity over time as well as there is change, and knowing that there's a little bit of an arbitrary component of like putting a start and an end date to anything. Because, you said at the very beginning of the conversation, like there were a lot of things happening before 1865 that needed to happen for there to be a growing labor movement. And that's a really good reminder. Well, Dr. Dylan Shearer, this was a really insightful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope that
Thanks for having me.
yeah, I hope the students have more and more food for thought as they engage with the unit. Thanks.